good evening. Welcome to the first session of the Jaspers Society of North America meeting. I'm glad you're here. I also welcome the people who will find us on YouTube. Therefore, I speak in the micro, and I will ask everyone else to actually do that too. My name is Almut Furchert. I'm currently a fellow at the Søren Kierkegaard Research Library in Northfield, Minnesota at beautiful St. Olaf College. And I will try to lead us through this evening, the next 3 hours. Let me introduce the author tonight. We have Professor Dr. Matthias Bormuth with us, who's from the University, Karl von Ossietzky University in Oldenburg. And he will introduce, we will speak about his book tonight, Life Conduct in Modern Times. And let me give you a brief introduction. So, Professor Bormuth followed his passion. He studied medicine in Marburg and Göttingen. He became a psychiatrist. Then he wrote his dissertation on Karl Jaspers, 2001, on the medical ethical aspects in Karl Jaspers, and followed with his habilitation, kind of the second doctorate, in 2008. What then followed have been Heisenberg fellowships at the University of Tübingen and Columbia University in New York. In 2012, Professor Bormuth became the Heisenberg Professor for Comparative Intellectual History at the Philosophical Institute in Oldenburg. So tonight we will discuss his book, and I'm very glad to welcome Professor Bormuth to the podium.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you for your kind words. It's a pleasure and an honor to be asked and able to speak here in this nice small audience, to this audience here. I think this gives the possibility of a concentrated discussion, which I'm very happy that we can have this tonight. When I was asked to give some words to my book, I thought I could do it in three steps. The first would be discontent in Freudian psychoanalysis. The second one would be thinking with Max Weber or beyond Jaspers. And the third would be philosophical implications or a pluralistic universe. I will try to explain those 3 points. The first is discontent in Freudian psychoanalysis. When I started out thinking about the book, I did it as a physician. I studied medicine in Marburg and Göttingen, and then went into the field of psychiatry. And during the first time of working, in the first 2 or 3 years, I had a certain discontent. I had great colleagues who did psychotherapy, psychoanalysis in Frankfurt, and with many talks and many Selbsterfahrungsgruppen, as we say in German, groups of self-experience. And one thing I recognized by the time, that although psychoanalysis was a wonderful tool for helping patients and understanding myself and my colleagues better, sometimes there was a certain dogmatic tendency in the way we were discussing things. And since I was brought up as a Christian young fellow, joining many groups in Christian churches, I was somehow recollected having this experience with my colleagues in Frankfurt, the avant-garde of the Freud Institute there, that this experience was almost the same than the experience I had with the church believers. And this discontent with a certain way of being too sure what one believes is the truth about human beings made me think I have to think about it. And I remembered Karl Jaspers, which I had read in my studies in Göttingen first, his autobiography and other things. And then I went to Basel and visited Hans Sahner, his last assistant, in 1992. And this experience going to Basel in the library of Jaspers, talking to Hans Sahner, gave me the kick to try not just to clear up this problem, but to flee out of psychiatry. This is something else that I recognized by thinking those things, that my own interest was more a philosophical one than a psychiatric one. I will come back to this later. So this is the first discontent with psychoanalysis, which made me think about the book and try to write it. And then I had the chance at the Graduiertenkolleg in Tübingen to do it, which was called Ethics in the Sciences, this graduate college. I was there. And in those years, I not just started reading the most works of Jaspers, but also Max Weber, because Jaspers in his works on psychiatry was saying, my thinking of psychiatry wouldn't have been nothing without Max Weber. But my experience reading Weber was that Weber was somewhat different from how Jaspers had understood him. So it's not just Jaspers who gives us comfort, also Max Weber. And this comfort is more critical sometimes and not that nice as Jaspers tries to comfort us with his existential philosophy. There are certain breaks in our modern experience which, for my estimation, are not covered by Jaspers really. And the perspective of Max Weber, his sociological thinking was for my interest and why I had a certain discontent in psychoanalysis quite clearing up. So and I try to understand or try to tell you what the points were which made me mostly think Weber is a good tool to understand Jaspers and my problem with psychoanalysis. As you know, there's a certain term in Weber, the disenchantment of the world. This is a popular term used by many people, and for me it was somehow the crucial tool to understand Jasper's criticism on psychoanalysis in the sociological horizon of a modern society. And if you want to sum up this term, disenchantment of the world, Weber is saying that sciences are very important for our world. Like we have to be enlightened by our sciences, and being enlightened by the sciences also means that the religious world and their values are vanishing somehow for the people who are intellectuals. There are many groups for whom those religious values are still in function and work, but for everybody who thinks of himself of being an intellectual, this becomes quite difficult. But this is just one side, the Weber of enlightenment. But Weber wouldn't have become a classic if there's not some ambivalence in him and his interest in science. And the other side of Weber and this term of disenchantment of the world is that he's saying, even if we become very enlightened, and even if sciences make great progresses, there are still things we cannot solve with science. And we all depend on somehow solutions which nobody can give to us. No religion, no science, just man himself can try to find up some thoughts, ideas, solutions for his problem of life, suffering, predictions, predicaments. So working with Weber left me in a certain way of ambivalence. On the one side there was science, and on the other side was philosophy and religion, and Weber was the one saying both sides have some authority, but this authority is limited, and man himself has to judge what his ultimate values should be. And taking this horizon, I looked back on Jaspers and psychoanalysis. And there's a second thing, a sociological description of Weber, that since values become responsibility of each individual, there is a certain withdrawal of values out of the greater societies for intellectuals and into a certain way he calls kleinste Gemeinschaftskreise, little communities. So this is somehow an effect of modern times that for intellectuals, those last values are not a question of society, but a question of kleinste Gemeinschaftskreise or little communities. And therefore, and this brings me to Jaspers and psychoanalysis, you have on the one side the possibility of kleinste Gemeinschaftskreise, communities in a dialogue led by the physician with the patient in some ways. And on the other side, as Jaspers is saying, a dialogue between friends, close people, he calls communication. And this was somehow the core thesis of my book, to see Jaspers was criticizing psychoanalysis over about 5 decades because he recognized very early that this scientific way of coming to values in a dialogue led by the physician is somehow an alternative to the existential way of coming to values in a certain form of dialogue. And for him, concerning and in regard to Max Weber, the scientific way of coming to a certain personal truth is in a certain way quite problematic, because the one person in the dialogue, the physician, is taken as an authority for the other one. And since those things those two talk about are personal values and not just questions for experts, it's very critical that the one person is taken as the authority for the other one. And you already have in the early Jaspers, in an essay which was held in 1915 in Heidelberg called Solitude, Einsamkeit, this criticism on the authority of the physician, which is taken by his patients as an authority too. So this seduction of being an authority or becoming an authority has two resources. The one is the physician who wants to be an important person for the other one. And the other thing is the need of the patient to have someone who takes the responsibility of finding values for him. So this was somehow for me the crucial aspect I found in Weber to understand Jaspers and his criticism on psychoanalysis. I want to come to my last point, the philosophical implications of the pluralistic universe. At the end of my work comparing Jaspers and Weber, I had to see that Jaspers himself didn't understand Weber quite well in his own value judgments. And the way I found it out was that I saw that Jaspers, in his criticism on psychoanalysis, was very polemical. And I asked, why is Jaspers, as a scientist and a psychiatrist and a philosopher, so polemical about Freud and his group? And one point was that the person who Jaspers took as the well-known psychoanalyst of his time was Otto Kross, a young anarchist who had somehow an idea of erotic movement bring into psychoanalysis. And this way of having a certain value which is very innerworldly, erotic redemption, Erlösung, was for Jaspers a point to be very critical, because this form of redemption, Erlösung, was brought in the name of science. But as Jaspers had to see that his hero, Max Weber, was not a Kantian as Jaspers was. Weber was in his early years until 1910 a Kantian sociologist whose great value was the ability of man to judge and to be responsible in a certain way. But the late Weber turned. So you could say until 1910, Jaspers and Weber were somehow having the same values. And in the last about 10 years of Weber's living, Max Weber turned himself to be a pluralistic person who even, and this is important, it does not just say a pluralistic world is necessary so that different people can have different values. No, the different values can be in one person, not just spread over society. Those values are the problem of the person himself or herself. So Weber was somehow making up an anthropology of the modern man who's torn in himself, not able to come to a certain solution where he's out of the problem of plurality in his own person. And you could say that Jaspers himself stayed in a certain way to a Kantian model of ultimate possibilities of freedom, of the metaphysical need of finding one idea, one perspective in life, and that he therefore had lost Weber as his hero. And the whole polemic against psychoanalysis was somehow a polemic against Weber at the end. But this is a new problem. I'm almost finished. And if I want to sum up what I learned from my dissertation is at the end, that in the words of Kant and Isaiah Berlin, man is a crooked timber of humanity. And in the words of Jaspers, that man is always more than he himself knows about him and than others know about him. Thank you.
well, the first critic tonight will be Dr. Roger Frie from Fraser University. He's faculty at the education department there. Dr. Frie holds a Doctor of Psychology and a Doctor of Philosophy in Phenomenology and Psychology. I do love these combinations. It's wonderful to be in a group where everybody does hold tensions together. And his interest in his scholarship is in the intersection of cultural and personal dimensions in psychological development. So let us welcome Dr. Roger Frie to the podium.
First of all, I want to say how honored I am to be here this evening, to be able to speak with you, and also to be able to discuss Professor Bormuth's just wonderful book. I'm being referred to as a critic, but I'm really someone who's going to appreciate it and ask some questions in the process. And perhaps much as Professor Bormuth began by discussing his background, I should say a few words about my background, since that will give you a sense of the perspective that I'm bringing to bear on the work. My original training is in philosophy and social theory and in the history of science, and in particular, I worked on Binswanger, Ludwig Binswanger. And he was, of course, a Swiss colleague of Jaspers for many, many years. They had both a personal relationship and a collegial relationship. It was at times strained, and the strained nature of that relationship also had to do with Jaspers' increasingly critical stance towards psychoanalysis in general, but perhaps psychotherapy in particular. So I will say a little bit about that. And I also want to bring my current reading to bear, and that is much of my research is currently on German responses to the Holocaust and understanding what is said and what is not said, what is known and what is not known. And in that light, I also wanted to focus on a few of the comments that Jaspers made that are quite curious, and in the hope that Professor Bormuth can help clarify some of those comments. Well, we'll see. It is without doubt that Jaspers' rejection of psychoanalysis is radical. And I have to admit straight away, I am a psychoanalyst. That said, I felt all along that Jaspers' critique of psychoanalysis was a critique of a very particular form of psychoanalysis and a very particular image of Freud. And one of the things I wondered was when I went back, and I first became aware of Jaspers through his book, General Psychopathology, which was published in 1913. And in that book, as I understand Jaspers, and I'm certainly no expert, Jaspers' argument was to focus on the form rather than the content of experience. And in that same sense, I wondered whether Jaspers' understanding of psychoanalysis may confuse content and form, or I should say content and process. I was trained in a form of psychoanalysis in which the entire focus is not on content of the individual mind, but on the actual process of experience, both between the physician and the patient, as well as the social process within society. And the individual is understood fundamentally as a social being. And if we look at psychoanalysis from that perspective, it feels to me at least that it allows us to ask some questions about what Jasper was perceiving. In any case, let me continue. Let me, in fact, start with the one lovely statement, and I quote Bormuth. Jasper's rejection of psychoanalysis is radical, and here's Jasper's quote. I look upon every physician who takes this path as lost, if he does not use the substance left in him to one day see clearly. Well, I fully admit to being lost to the extent that I do have the identity as a psychoanalyst. There's another quote of Jaspers that I'd like to read, and it's a wonderful quote. To get to know the individual is comparable to a sea voyage over limitless seas to discover a continent. Every landing on a shore or island will teach certain facts, but the possibility of further knowledge vanishes if one maintains that here one is at the center of things. One's theories are then like so many sandbanks on which we stay fast without really winning land. And I feel that in that statement, Jaspers is asking us to hold our theories lightly, not to put too much stock in our theories, but to actually stay with the experience of the individual. And it felt to me with time that Jaspers, at least when it came to his understanding of the theory of psychoanalysis, held on to a perception more and more strongly with the years. And I was curious about that. I didn't fully understand it. And it felt to me that that perception of psychoanalysis began to interfere with his ability to understand the enormous changes in the field that actually began in the 1920s with the work of Binswanger, who was a fundamental and staunch critic of Freud, but never fully separated from psychoanalysis. So that just as a way of understanding. But let me turn for a moment to the historical and the political context of Jaspers' critique. These are the ones that are particularly interesting. Bormuth tells us that in a letter written to the German psychiatrist Karl Friedrich von Weizsäcker in 1953, Jaspers makes the strangest of all possible parallels between psychoanalysis and National Socialism. Referring to psychoanalysis, Jaspers states, quote, "It is analogous to the discussions on National Socialism in 1933. It has some good aspects. It succeeded in eliminating unemployment. It effected national restoration, etc. As the opposing view goes, it is of the devil, and for this reason it must be rejected completely. And the appeal to the individual must be aware that you are dealing with the devil. You are ending up in realms in which you do not want to be." Powerful words. How do we understand that statement? Who's the devil? Freud? The entire psychoanalytic profession? As any practicing psychoanalyst will admit, the profession has been called many things. Given the state of the field today, what comes immediately to mind is out of touch, dinosaur, a waste of resources, but a devil? That's new. How do we understand it? What is Jasper saying? Indeed, what is going on here in these statements, written a mere 8 years after the end of the war and in knowledge of the Holocaust? It is one thing to criticize psychoanalysis, and as I will point out in a moment, I think that Jaspers makes some excellent points, particularly early on. It is quite another to converse in this manner, even if it occurs in a private rather than public correspondence. And who is Jaspers' interlocutor? As Bormuth tells us in a footnote, quoting the German psychoanalyst Alexander Michle, von Weizsäcker was, quote, "one of those to throw Freud's work, The Future of Illusion, into the fire in May 1933 in the framework of book burnings organized by the National Socialists, calling it self-glorification of doubt, and moreover, feeling the necessity to knuckle under political coercion by demonstrably severing his ties to Freud." Again, very curious. What do we know of this period? Well, there's a great deal, and I don't have time to go into it. The history is absolutely fascinating, just as it is tragic. Peter Gay, who was Freud's historian, quotes Freud, who made a dryly ironic yet potent statement just after the book burnings took place. Freud says, quote, "What progress we are making. In the Middle Ages, they would have burned me. Now they are content with burning my books." Freud's family, of course, was not so lucky. Freud was able to escape with his daughter in 1938 to London. Three of Freud's sisters were deported to Treblinka, where they were murdered in the gas chambers in 1942. The Nazis denounced psychoanalysis as a Jewish science, and little remained within a year of their coming to power in 1933. The Goering Institute is itself infamous. We learned that the centralization of psychotherapy in the new Goering Institute was, quote, in Jasper's eyes, quite a fortunate development, especially considering the fact that in his view, the establishment of a centralized institution increased the chances of setting up a scientifically standardized psychotherapy considerably. Now, Bormuth recognizes the seriously questionable implications of Jasper's statement, adding, Jaspers did not even problematize the fact of its having been the result of political coercion demanding the fusion. And still, I wonder. I found myself feeling some growing sense of disillusionment with Jaspers, perhaps not unlike the disillusionment that Jaspers felt in his hero, Max Weber, and is described so wonderfully and touchingly in the book. Now, Jaspers himself was in an imperiled personal situation during the National Socialism and had a principled political stance in the post-war years. He was married to his wife for many, many decades, and she was German Jewish, and they feared for their lives throughout the period of National Socialism. Afterwards, he was involved in the denazification process as far as Heidegger was concerned, and did not recommend Heidegger's return. And the principled stance of Jaspers has always stood out for me as enormously important. Thus my confusion and my hope that we can talk about these statements a little bit. Another interesting question is the question of plurality within psychoanalysis. I'm certainly familiar with the Sigmund Freud Institute in Frankfurt. I gave a talk there last summer, and it is indeed an institute that is still very Freudian in nature. And there are a great many institutes that are not Freudian in nature. Indeed, when one speaks of the term psychoanalysis today, one doesn't generally imply Freud, right? Starting in the 1920s, certainly by the 1930s, many psychoanalysts had moved beyond Freud. Psychoanalysts are much more likely to read intersubjectivists or even someone like George Herbert Mead today than they are Freud. Now, I have the benefit of hindsight in looking back. During the 1960s, the latter period of the critique developed by Jaspers, that was certainly not the case in Germany. And in fact, German psychoanalysis in the post-war years really, I think, made a powerful return to Freud, in part because of what had happened during National Socialism. And so that there was and still is perhaps a certain dogmatism at work that isn't at work in other areas. I was trained at the William Alanson White Institute, which was founded by Harry Stack Sullivan and Erich Fromm. And the approach to psychoanalysis, of course, was manifestly different than the target of Jaspers' critique in this book. And it's just worth thinking about. One other point of interest had to do with the fact that Jaspers relied on Hannah Arendt's descriptions of what was happening in New York amongst the traditional psychoanalytic institutes, but he was not himself seemingly aware of the diversity of views. So, what I've done is I've raised a number of questions, but I've raised these questions in true appreciation. I found the book fascinating. I thought it filled a very important gap in the literature, certainly in the history of psychoanalysis. I have always looked upon Jaspers with a sense of admiration, and having read this book, that admiration continues. But it is perhaps precisely because of that fact that my curiosity was piqued, and I was left with a sense of genuine puzzlement as to how to make sense of all of this. So my hope is that in the discussion that follows, we might achieve some small measure of clarity. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Roger, for your comments and your talk. And I loved the end, that you are puzzled. That was somehow a thing I loved about working about Jaspers very much, that I was left with open questions. And for my understanding, Jaspers could not be taken as a hero. He has some shortcomings in his theory, and you put some, or you shed some light on the ambivalent way he's talking about National Socialism, psychoanalysis, and the comparisons he's making in those letters and other things. And he himself, one has to say, did not behave in the beginning of 1933 as we think from looking back. He was himself fascinated by what happened in Germany until March, April, until the violence started. So he himself, even he was married to a Jewish woman, was somehow impressed and influenced by the new movement in Germany. And so talking about 1933 in this comparison and knowing his own story may be somehow a way of coming to terms with his own problems at those times, of liking the devil a bit, at least. So this is somehow a point one could make too. And the other thing is, and you read those passages that Jaspers at those years in 1953 for was somehow warning everybody even to get in touch with psychoanalysis. And this late position of Jaspers is not the early one. So in the beginnings he was quite open to psychoanalysis and even to the possibility to get to know the unconscious movements in human beings and their implications for our judgments and for our behavior. But this turned with the years. And for my opinion, the main person in the background positively is Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche's theory of resentment was very important for the early Jaspers to somehow become an idea how influential unconscious feelings and resentments and things could be for the behavior and thinking of people. And as we all know, Freud himself was influenced by Friedrich Nietzsche. Max Weber was influenced by the theory of resentment of Friedrich Nietzsche. William James was influenced by this theory. And there you could see somehow the father of the unconscious and its implications for our thinking and behavior. And the late Jaspers would have done better if he would have stayed to this early openness concerning the unconscious and its implication for our conscious life, our behavior and thinking. And one can ask why Jaspers was so harsh at the end. What was his inner resistance, his own resentment? And those questions are not solved yet. And there should be written greater intellectual history of Jaspers, putting him somehow in a light that would destroy more of the great hero we still see in him. And somehow, this is my judgment today, this criticism on psychoanalysis is not a good thing, because it closed for many people the openness to see how unconscious things are working in us. And the only good thing and the most important thing why this criticism is on the other side valuable is that Jaspers was seeing very early how this ability to see unconscious possibilities in man and to clarify them is connected to the seduction of becoming an authority and of knowing too well. And this goes to the beginning of your talk. Too well in the name of a certain theory or certain concepts, how man functions. And even in Frankfurt, I remember very well the talks with colleagues from the Freud Institute. You could say they were those ones with a clear dogmatic position who were in power somewhere, and the other ones who had this ability of thinking and asking and being self-critical. And I would say this divided attitude between those who are very dogmatic and clear what they do and want and see, and the other ones who are self-critical, you have in all sciences, in all fields, in philosophy, in religion, in social sciences. And therefore, I do not like how Jaspers is concentrating this ambivalence to psychoanalysis and to certain fields of biological research. Thanks.
The next one on critics in the program is Professor Osborne Wiggins, but he cannot be here. He's sick. He's a professor emeritus at the University of Louisville. And Dr. Aaron Mishara was so kind to say he would actually read the critic by Osborne Wiggins tonight so that we can include him here in spirit. Aaron Mishara is just another colleague who is a doctor of psychology and a doctor of philosophy. He's currently a faculty at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology in Los Angeles, and he does research in phenomenological descriptive approaches to psychopathology. So thank you for doing this, lending Professor Wiggins your voice, though you Aaron Mishara has very much also his own voice, and you can hear his paper tomorrow evening.
A kind introduction, and also I wanted to say it's an honor to speak for Ozzy tonight. I've heard him give many talks, including the Aaron Gurvich lecture, I believe, at the SPEP meeting and other places, so I'm pleased to be doing this. On page 123 of his marvelous book, Matthias Bormuth quotes Michle and then asks a central question, which in its implications ought to be considered one of the main questions for philosophers to address today in the modern age. Our age of spiritual destitution, modernity, carries a very heavy burden for persons who would be thoughtful and honest about their own personal plight. I shall quote Bormuth on page 123, who immediately after quoting Michle writes, despite all the rhetoric, Michele's critique contains a question which has been raised time and again concerning the concept of existence philosophy, namely, the questions as to whether its conscious abandonment of culturally unequivocal signifiers does not overstrain humankind's capacity, unquote. This question can be formulated thus. How can the modern individual be expected to decide on his or her own course in life when the unbelievability of institutional meaning systems, quote, the conscious abandonment of culturally unequivocal signifiers, unquote, makes them unacceptable and thus, by default, thrusts the responsibility for choosing the individual's own personal meaning system back onto his or her own shoulders. The core problem of life in modernity is that it has stamped every choice of a personal meaning system as merely subjective, that is grounded in nothing but the individual's own free choice. As a free choice, this choice can always be changed, another value system freely chosen to replace it. Why not? In other words, the pure subjectivity of the foundation of individual choice renders it completely unstable and ultimately unbelievable too, along with the unbelievability of the institutional meaning systems as well. Doesn't this modern condition place too heavy a responsibility, too heavy a burden on the individual's own shoulders? Ozzy asks, how are we to bear it?
I like very much that he stresses this point, and this leads me back to Max Weber and his idea of a society which is not able, as he calls it, to develop a monumentale Kultur, monumental culture. And at that point you can see that Jaspers was taking the view of Weber's of the modern intellectuals, and this heavy burden is very strong. Those people should know for themselves what they think and not rely on a monumental culture of a time. But you can ask, where are those people? And where are the possibilities of people to develop a personal culture? And Weber did not solve this problem. He's somehow giving those idol types. On the one side, the society, and on the other side, the community. the small community of people. And the example of Heidelberg, where Jaspers lived in the circle around Max Weber, where all those people, those great intellectuals, some come from literature, some from science, came together on Sundays and other events and exchanged ideas, like a certain campus. This is a very extreme privilege to live in such a community of people who have the chance to come into contact with ideas. But the question is this possibility, this privilege, a privilege everybody has? Or are we responsible for giving the people somehow in the society possibilities of gaining values in a different way? And is there the right to look down to those people which do not have this privilege of making up their minds in certain communities, like universities, the good ones, or schools, the good ones? So here somehow Jaspers takes the elite position of his time, which is on one side very respectable and a great thing, this German education he still had, and which somehow, for my estimation, moved to the US, to certain universities now, is still there, and did not take the standpoint and the sensibility for the mass society, for people who do not have the chance to live in those close communities, to make up their minds and come into close encounters with perspectives of values. And one can understand why people are open to psychoanalysts who give them somehow value perspectives too, because the possibility to come into contact with people who can give them ideas how to structure their lives is very poor normally. And the psychoanalyst could be the only one who is able to give values, to give a certain idea. But, and this is my point, he should be self-critical and telling his patient, I have a certain value horizon which is connected to my way of seeing you as a person. And being my patient means somehow coming to the influence of a certain culture, Western culture, Eastern culture, whatever, but a certain culture which goes into the way I'm seeing you as a person, I'm seeing your problems, your unconscious life, and it might be the good one, or the good possibility for you, but it might not. And we in Oldenburg, in the Jaspers house, had last year speaking an elderly lady who was herself a patient for a long time, wrote books about her experience as someone who went to different psychoanalysts. And the interesting thing was that she had to had 3 analyses which didn't work out until the 4th one came, and this went perfectly because she found the person who corresponded to her. And she was so clearly able to give us an expression of what happened to her, that we all were impressed of this possibility that 2 people find each other with the same cultural background, and the background goes into the way they see and talk about the unconscious life. And therefore, I would say those examples show how valuable psychoanalysis could be as a tool in a time without values to help people. Thank you.
Well, it also shows what we now know from studies, that the relationship between client and psychotherapist seemed to be the crucial part in psychotherapy. So that makes totally sense. Let me introduce you to our third critic this night, which is Dr. Ed Mendelowitz. He's a psychologist, a practicing psychologist, writer, and educator. He has been a teaching assistant to Rollo May, one of the figures in American humanist psychology, and is currently faculty at Saybrook University. So let's welcome Dr. Mendelowitz to the podium.
So I call this little critique or commentary, really, Carl Jaspers and life conduct, a theme with variations. It's interesting. I sort of unconsciously changed your title around, and I wasn't really aware of it until Helmut had asked that we send our talking points to him, and I read Roger's draft of his paper, and I agreed with it all, actually, but it wasn't what really interested me at all in Professor Bormuth's book, and so I want to start just with a quote from Kafka, who says, "Contemplation and activity have their apparent truth, but only the activity radiated by contemplation, or rather that which returns to it again, is truth." So I should begin my comments with a disclaimer. I'm by no means any kind of Jaspers scholar. He is someone that I have admired since my doctoral days years ago in Berkeley, someone who indeed inspired my dissertation inquiry into those so-called boundary events, those limit points on the periphery of all epistemological circles into which, in Nietzsche's words, one stares into what defies illumination. Jaspers is someone I often find difficult to precisely grasp, yet he's a man I continue to hold as exemplar and to whose work I continue to return over time. Now, there's a well-known 1965 press conference in which a 25-year-old poet named Dylan holds court with the press at the KQED radio studio in San Francisco, and it goes something like this. Questioner, do you consider yourself a politician? Dylan, do I consider myself a politician? Well, I guess so. Pause. I have my own party, though. Questioner, does it have a name? Dylan, there's no presidents in the party or vice presidents or secretaries or anything like that, so it's pretty hard to get into it. Questioner, is there any right wing or left wing to that party? No, it's more or less in the center. Questioner, do you think your party could ever end the war with China? I think it's Ginsburg that's asking that question. I don't know. I don't know if they would have people over there that would be in any of the same kind of party, you know? It might be kind of hard to infiltrate. I don't think my party would ever be approved for the White House or anything like that. Questioner, is there anyone else in this party? Dylan, no, most of us don't even know each other. It's hard to tell who's in it and who's not. Questioner, do you recognize them when you see them? Dylan, oh, you can recognize them when you see them. Now, some of you are probably thinking that this guy has wandered into the wrong lecture hall or conference, but I would like to render not so much an apology as a thought. Dylan is articulating here an ethos that is by and large inwardly conceived. It's lonely where I'm at, he says a little later on in the interview. One that soars above the crowd, those with long legs, says Nietzsche somewhere. One unlikely to be discerned by those not already in the know. The attentive ear picks up echoes of Jasper's esoteric and significantly unscripted code in all of this. No doubt the poet pulls it off with a humor and elan that the philosopher cannot quite match. Still, Jasper's insistence upon existence philosophical ideas that are difficult to articulate and ultimately unmeasurable, indeed largely unredeemable in the marketplace of everyday concerns, is profoundly moving to me, not least of all for the fact that Jaspers actually does seem to have lived out his life on these rarefied moral planes. What better proof could there be than the embodied example in life? Always in Jaspers, the abiding attunement to matters of character, the possibilities of and prospects for, in Professor Bormuth's apt words, the ethically consistent life, an ethos and way of being in the world found, Jasper says, only in the smallest circles of transcendentally rooted individuals and lives. The capacity to radiate humanity, the consequence of a morally convincing life shaped by philosophical reflection. And relatedly, an understanding of religion is bound up inextricably with comportment. Form and movement, says Beckett. Or in Jasper's lexicon, the ethicization of faith. Like our own William James, Jaspers points to the penumbra of consciousness and experience that beckoning Jamesian more. And equally like James, the cash value, James's term, these guys value so differently than so many of us in terms of life conduct. The rarefaction of character and its enactment in authentic friendship and the sanctified place within the home. Equally resonant is Jaspers on education and the non-authoritarian charisma to which he alludes. A philosophy of teaching that points beyond the transmission of knowledge to the catalyzation of, quote, actual faith. The true teacher is perhaps akin to the Zen master who points to the moon. It is imperative that students be turned on to the larger meanings and images without getting stuck unnecessarily on the master's finger. The skillful teacher, like the effective psychotherapist, is an intermediary figure who remains attentive to her or his dignified yet transitional role. There is a South African pianist, his name is Abdullah Ibrahim, and he talks about a term that is used in the world of jazz, transmission, and spelled just like that, T-R-A-N-C-E, mission. And what is meant by this term is a kind of state of mind or state of consciousness that is transmitted through the music and from musician to musician and there from musician to audience. Ibrahim is a South African pianist, a very accomplished one, and he proposes jazz itself as a model of ethics and a community for the 21st century. So I would say that reading Jasper's Mankind in the Modern Age and listening to Coltrane at the same time on the stereo, this is a sympathetic and mutually edifying pair. Something very moving to me. As I say, I agree with all of Roger's points, really. But I still am quite moved by reading Professor Bormuth's book and this kind of, I would call it a Gnostic language almost of psychotherapy, what it might be, especially the language where he uses to discuss the place of encounter, existential communication, he says, without the least exertion of force, self-reflection free of all compulsion. It's also important, I think, to say that Jaspers isn't the only one who was talking about these things. This guy Becker, who I mentioned earlier, is very much influenced by Otto Rank, who was kicked out of, at a certain point, of Freud's circle. But he is also talking about psychotherapy as ultimately an affective experience, and also valuing the relationship as the thing which underwrites the entire endeavor. But I like very much this language of Jaspers. also his sort of speaking to the place of the self-reflection of the analyst. It's not simply a matter of technique. The existential encounter is something much deeper than this. And I like the professor's story about the woman that goes through 4 analysts to finally find the right one, because this is something that indeed Jaspers does talk about, this business of finding the right match. And he talks also about Freud in the end as a psychologist who does not measure up to the great self-confessors Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. Well, I don't mind that either. I mean, who does? You know. Also, Jaspers on hidden, this as opposed to vanish transcendence. Kafka had, like Jaspers, just a few close friends through life. One of the more intriguing was a young man by the name of Gustav Janak. When he was maybe in his very early 20s, he befriended Kafka for a period of years, and the two of them would wander through the streets of Prague. And he would go home and essentially write down everything that had transpired. On one occasion, the following discussion ensued. "Do you mean that the truth is always closed to us?" Kafka was silent. His eyes became quite small and dark. For a few moments, he contemplated the tips of his fingers as they lay on the desk. Then he said gently, "God, life, truth, they're only different names that we give to the fact." I pressed him further, "But can we grasp it?" "We experience it," said Kafka in a slightly troubled voice. "The fact to which we give different names and which we try to apprehend by various processes of thought pervades our veins, our nerves, our senses. It is within us. For that reason, perhaps it's invisible. What we can really grasp is the mystery, the darkness. God dwells in it. And this is a good thing, because without protecting the darkness, we should try to overcome even God. That is man's nature." And this passage, too, I think, like Dylan's, facilitates through association an understanding of Jaspers' esoteric message and code. The blocking of one's capacity for wonder and the loss of the capacity to appreciate mystery can have serious effects on our psychological health, not to mention the health of our whole planet, observes Rollo May in his final article, The Loss of Wonder. So once again, the sanctity of the private and quietly rarefied life. Professor Bormuth writes of the virtue of a primarily inward individual cosmos invested with meaningfulness, which is independent of society and can never take on clear contours in the public sphere. Yes, I believe he and Jaspers are onto something significantly right, the more so in these modern times of what the Czech writer Milan Kundera calls imagology, an obsession with image, with selfies, graphomania, even the NSA. Existence philosophical conduct recognized solely on the basis of, quote, exceptional moral action. As in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, though I do not think of Jaspers as especially humble, it is decidedly other than the public show of virtue. Nietzsche muses in his notebook, "I have found strength where one does not look for it. Simple, mild, and pleasant people without the least desire to rule. And conversely, the desire to rule has often appeared to me a sign of inner weakness. They fear their own slave soul and shroud it in a royal cloak. The powerful natures dominate. It is a necessity. They need not lift one finger, even if during their lifetime they bury themselves in a garden house." Intimated, it seems to me, throughout Jaspers is the place of suffering. Truth can cause pain, he writes, and drive one to despair. but it is capable, merely in being truth, of giving deep satisfaction. There is truth, after all. The prospects, as Professor Bormuth puts it, for living without metaphysical refuge, and relatedly, the place of shipwreck. Deprived of his world by the crisis, Jaspers writes, man has to reconstruct it from the beginning. There opens to him the supreme possibility of freedom, or the alternative of sinking into nullity. Both alternatives, he observes starkly, are possible. Further, Jaspers valuing simultaneously of both scientific method and the broader humanities. Each is given its due, though, as the professor tells us, the former especially so. So much of the literature of the third force in psychology, and perhaps the psychoanalytic literature as well, remains compulsively inattentive to the biological realms. And there are grave risks, it seems to me, of inattention to either end of the dialectic. Jaspers is a principled antidote to this sort of thing. Why in the States is it always Heidegger and so seldom Jaspers? Yes, he loses composure here and there, and is not without blind spots. But this is the human, all too human element, to which we are all of us heir. He hits so many notes, up and down and along the spectrum of being, and methodology is not discounted. Let me conclude by returning to my frontispiece and to Kafka, who, in conversation with his young acolyte, meditates also on awareness and life conduct. But how does one do that? How does one proceed, asks Janak? Is there some sure guide? No, there is none, said Kafka, shaking his head. There is no route map on the way to truth. The only thing that counts is to make the venture of total dedication. A prescription would already imply a withdrawal, a mistrust, and therewith the beginning of a false path. One must accept everything patiently and fearlessly. Man is condemned to life, not death. Yes, I think the poet Kafka, whose sisters also perished in the camps, deserves a spot in Jasper's existence, philosophical church, or a synagogue just as well.
Thank you very much for your talk. I liked it a lot. And I think Jaspers would have loved it too, because you hit really the point of the religious question in Jaspers and his idea of psychotherapy. At the end you said you used the word church, and I was writing it down in the beginning already. And in this book, Man in Modern Age, Jaspers, I think, uses the term hidden church, which was used by different people, which is a theological term too, of the possibility of a religious group which is not discernible by certain dogmatic beliefs or a certain way of showing them in the public, but of sharing a certain mystery, a certain belief in a special way without taking care of the outer experience or not experience, appearance of themselves. And in the middle of your talk, you were quoting Jasper's enthusiasm about the possibility of the dialogue, of the communication between people, and the ability to come on one's own way to this communication and to building up somehow a church. And there's this famous speech of Hannah Arendt from the late 1950s where she talks about Jaspers and the metaphor of light he gives and the idea of communication. And then she turns to Jaspers as the author of the great philosophers and telling the public that Jaspers was for her. She visited him once a year, coming from New York to Basel, and talked for him about 8 to 10 days about the Zeitgenossenschaft. I don't know the English word Zeitgenossenschaft, the sharing of the community with others, even with people who are already dead, with all those great philosophers. And communication, seen by Jaspers, means the Zeitgenossenschaft with those who are living, who are close to us, in the way we talk with them about our inner life, our ways we see the life, and the ability to share time with those who are already dead, and to make them like our companions in our daily life. And this way of leading a philosophical life, I think, is one of the most precious things Jaspers can teach young students, elderly people, that it's worthwhile being in contact with the great philosophers, and not just the Western ones, also the ones from the East, also the great authors. And he, in the late 1940s, developed the term of the axial age, of the openness in a certain slot of time from the 8th century to the 2nd century before Christ, where all those great philosophies and religions were born with a monotheistic perspective. And you were at the end talking about the church and the synagogue. And Jaspers, as you know too, was quite influenced by his wife Gertrude. And from his beginnings, he was somehow a cultural Protestant without any special religious belief, a typical upper-class Protestant, which went to church almost only at Christmas time. And the first essays on Jaspers, from Jaspers, even in the General Psychopathology, were very critical on Christianity. And then he married this wife Gertrude, and she somehow convinced Jaspers that the sphere of religion is worthwhile too, to be recognized, and that there's a certain deep possibility in a religious life between Judaism and Christian beliefs. And in later times, Jaspers opened up for different religions too. And so you could say this openness for religion, Jaspers owes very strongly his wife Gertrude. And this way of being open for religions connects him in a certain way to Max Weber, and you were quoting to William James. And this was, for me, my reading of James and Max Weber, very impressive, that both of them, before Jaspers turned to this position too, knew very well that the cultural way the Protestant people were living in their times were somehow shallow in the ability to grasp what religious life really could be. When you read William James comparing to Henry James, you always have the sensibility for the real religious life, which is led by those people who are not upper class, who are sects, who are somewhere psychopathological, interesting. And James, as Max Weber, turned to those people and not to the religion of their class. Somehow telling their time, those people who may look not very intellectual somehow, not very enlightened, may be those one who are very important for the inner life of modern man, for the ability to turn to one perspective, to take it earnest. And still in James and Weber, there was a certain ambivalence concerning this religious life. They both were very much fascinated by those people, but still in a distant position. And the trap of reason somehow is that Jaspers in his beginning was such a cultural upper-class person, and he turned with the years to a person who was very open for this religious life without any distance, as Weber and James still had at the end. James, you could say, like the biographers were talking about it, what the mystery of his belief could be. So he's somewhere in between Jaspers and Weber, but it's something else. But thank you for opening up this perspective. I think it's very important to understand Jaspers. And I think it's a privilege to have a philosopher who's open to say and see that philosophy is not something else than religion. It's just another possibility to open up to a reality which is above our understanding. And you could say Kant, the great hero for Jaspers, who stayed his hero, is the great religious personality for him, declaring in his critique of pure reason that even he, as a great intellectual, feels a metaphysical need and feels the need somehow to develop certain ideas. God, Unsterblichkeit, I don't know the English word, and freedom. So in the background of Jaspers, and maybe James too, he read the Critique of Pure Reason very intensively, is Kant as the person who is enlightened and who still, because he is enlightened, clear to say that we all have a certain metaphysical or religious need. And from here you could draw to, if I could, but I don't, a line to Heidegger, who's trying to tell everybody how greatly his philosophy is beyond the metaphysical need, not seeing how metaphysical it is. But thank you.
After talking about metaphysical needs, there's one more voice for tonight to welcome at the podium as a critic to the book. It is Professor Stephen Erickson. He is professor for the humanities and philosophy at Pomona College. Dr. Erickson's expertise is in Heidegger, European thought tradition, the future of human spirituality, all interesting things I like to learn more about. And his research interest is in the intersection of the human spirit and culture in our time, and in medicine and existential philosophy. So let's welcome Dr. Erickson to the podium.
So many terribly intriguing things have been said just by you and by your critics, so-called, that I don't know really what I'm going to say that will quite resemble what I thought I would say when I came this evening. I think this is a very good and important book. I think it's historical, and in a good sense of that. I'm going to come to that, and it provides a certain template for further work. This may be a way of saying when you do a job well, your reward is to get a new assignment. It could be to say that no good deed goes unpunished, but I'll go from there. My own experience, which has been helpful in understanding some of these matters, is that for a while I spent time with a few of the psychoanalytic institutes in Los Angeles. They thought, I think, initially that they could use a philosopher to help them solve problems. Kind of indication of how little they knew about how philosophy so often works. That is to say, we more hope to disclose and clarify problems and don't always have an incredible amount of good luck in altogether solving them. But what I noticed in the course of this was the following, that there turn out, among other things, to be what I'll call disclosure issues regarding psychoanalytic practice. And I won't be referring so much to Freud now, but to some of the people under discussion, in the 1980s, and at least a few of them still under discussion. One would be Otto Kernberg. Another maybe preeminent, at least in West Coast circles, but elsewhere, is Heinz Kohut. Another John Ghetto, another Merton Gill. And you could say of the kinds of theories they had that if you were a patient and went to one of them, certain things would either be discovered or would be placed upon you as your problem. Let's go back a little further historically. If you saw a Kleinian, you turned out to have an envy problem. If you saw Heinz Kohut type people, you'd have a certain deficit as opposed to a conflict needing to be resolved. You'd need more empathy than you would interpretation. I was very intrigued with the reference to Kafka. Remember, one of the remarks Kafka makes is that literature is like an axe that breaks a frozen sea within us. And I think psychoanalysis has that same capacity, but I'm not altogether sure the extent to which one goes back as far as Freud, at least in the American setting, to sort this out. Initially, I was quite taken back that I discovered in the so-called didactic courses at least one of the psychoanalytic institutes, they weren't reading Freud himself, they were reading a textbook by Charles Brenner. This is in Arlo and Brenner fame in the New York psychoanalytic circles. And these are really good people, the psychoanalysts that I did seminars with. They perhaps had a lot of zoology and chemistry background as undergraduates, caught up in the medical as opposed to a more cultural philosophical model, maybe more optimistic than a European spirit about what can finally be done. But now I want to turn to the book itself, and to do that I have to look at notes that actually I had prepared before I arrived and see what they might have to offer. The point you make, and a very good one, I think, is that the Weber's sociological theory of modernity makes Jasper's critique of psychoanalysis more comprehensible. I think that's probably true. I need to know more about this. I'll speak more confidently than I feel. I think that's true personally and culturally regarding Jaspers, but I'm not convinced that we need Weber to understand the philosophical comprehensibility of Jasper's critique. And I just don't know, so I'm asking it more as a question, far less as a criticism. I think there's an implied kind of deterministic strain, of course, in Freudian theory. And along with that, a kind of concentration or emphasis on instincts that would be somewhat foreign to what I know of the European tradition that would include Jaspers. With regard to the postulate of value freedom and the notion that that postulate is a kind of meta-scientific framework for understanding Jasper's arguments, what would you think if someone said, well, what we have there is a kind of emphasis on the Kantian theme. The Kantian theme we find in Kant's antinomies in the Critique of Pure Reason. And the postulate of value freedom is just to talk about one of the theses of one of the four antinomies. That's merely to mention another way of making this, I think, very significant point you've made. You say, as far as I know, utterly rightly, that he wants, Jaspers wants, a model of life conduct based on existence philosophy. I think there's a certain tension that's going to be inevitable here, because a model of life conduct based on existence philosophy is, I suppose, at times difficult to reconcile with a conservative sort of traditional bent of most societies. And an American philosopher, much praised and also heavily and sometimes very negatively criticized, Richard Rorty, talks about this very issue of how you have a kind of individual and personal autonomy, but some sense of solidarity and cohesion with the society around you. It seems to me classical psychoanalysis, from what I can say about it, is inherently traditional and conservative. It more reconciles people to the way things are and to their lot in life than it is liberating for them, unless you mean that where es was, ich shall be, that sense of liberation. Another thing that comes to mind, and this is on page 131, you say it many places, I mean, it's right. I think what you say is just right, that what Jaspers wants is the justification of authority as something to be left up to the individual. And again, I think that's important. That's clarifying of a lot of things that should be hopes in psychoanalysis and are parts of Jaspers' thinking. But to have a justification of authority left up to the individual has some problematic aspects with respect to what I think this evening I'm called social stability and cohesiveness. I'm not sure really finally to what extent. One last point, and this I got from page 40. You talk about the enduring of metaphysical emptiness and the metaphysical emptiness of modernity without its false filling. Here, let me get that one passage, and you said it far better than I've come close to saying it. This is on page 40 in our English edition, in the middle of the page. What now impresses Jaspers as Weber's monumental accomplishment is the fact that he endured the metaphysical emptiness of modernity with intellectual probity and had not filled the void with surrogate meaning. I think that's terribly important. I think in important ways that statement is a precursor and a kind of lead up to the sort of thing that Heideggerians are likely to say about the need both to have a certain openness to what turns out to be a void without some kind of cultural or pseudo-religious anticipatory filling of that void. And I think that's very important material. I said at the beginning I thought that what you've written was really good, something I'm not inclined to say very often, but I really think it's good. And I think it is a kind of model for other sorts of work that people should do in this country, for instance, in some kind of attempted conversation with what has happened with the psychoanalytic movement over the last 30 or more years. So thank you very much for what you've said. I think it's unfortunately in certain ways groundbreaking in the way that it opens up an opportunity for a genuine conversation that, let's hope, goes forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much too for those remarks. I'm happy about them, and I'm especially happy about the first remark on the historical perspective. I myself feel more than a historian. I'm not a philosopher. I came from medicine. I'm now an intellectual historian, whatever this is. I feel as a historian who's interested in the way people grasp ideas and make these ideas live in their lives. And I think philosophers do not like history too much often. It's disturbing them. Analytical philosophy wants to be clearly, abstractly working, and history is not clear. Our passions, drives, chances disturb all the time what we are thinking. But since human beings are human and historical, we have to think about history. And for me, the most important philosopher who thought about history and its implication for our philosophy was Nietzsche. And you were mentioning him too before, and Nietzsche's philosophy of life, his Lebensphilosophie, I think is our modern situation. And it's nothing wrong with philosophy being analytical and trying to clear up terms. But at the end, somehow, those terms have to come into contact with the people. And the implication of those terms for a certain life in its chances and personal conditions has to be thought of. And I think this task is in between history and philosophy. And the academic discipline doesn't serve the problem at the end. But since we're all humans, we have to solve the problem. And we cannot ask academia. And I think, therefore, those historical questions of philosophy are always, at last, up to the persons. And from my understanding, Jaspers himself didn't like history either. His idea of philosophy was quite idealistic at the end. He was close to Kant, as I tried to say. And he really tried to find an answer, as Kant did. And as far as I can say, Jaspers did not stay a psychotherapist. He became a philosopher with a psychotherapeutic attitude, trying to help the people, trying to show a certain way how one could live and feel redemption in his life, a word of comfort, yeah? This is something typical for Jaspers. And I like very much your last remark on Weber and Heidegger. I think Weber himself tried to be a hero, and Jaspers, the way that, as Jaspers put it, how much of truth can I take? And the intellectual way of, or intellectual Redlichkeit, I don't know what the English word for Redlichkeit is, the intellectual consequence or clearness was one of the most important points of Weber. And in his time, and especially in Heidelberg in 1910 times, talking to people like George from the literature world, the other ones who were all giving certain answers. Yeah? Weber was the one who was saying, it's interesting, it's an anthropological need to give answers, but we as intellectuals are those who should be open for the problems which are still staying with us. I'm not that sure that Heidegger didn't want to become a prophet. In the way he was celebrating this attitude of being open for things to come. I think there's somehow a difference between him and Weber. Weber did not really know whether things would come. He had his lover at the end. With her he came somehow in a certain way, and this is somehow tragic that this person didn't want to wait, or didn't had the ability to believe in something coming. And the only redemption Weber could experience in his time was the redemption of a certain form of being together with a person, sharing the problem of despair somehow, and the ability of coming together. And I think this very deep way of erotic life, Jaspers understood at the end, a bit at least. This sharing of another person, of the time being together, forgetting everything else, because one does not want to awake out of this form of being together, feeling the despair again. And this brings me somehow to Kafka again. I like very much how you talked about him, and I think there's a certain difference to Jaspers too. And I have to think about myself, because I'm not a great Kafka reader until now. When I start reading him, somehow I become nervous. He puts me in a certain ambivalence, in a certain insecurity. And I think this insecurity Kafka is expressing for himself and for us is our modern situation. We feel the need, but we're not able to somehow have a hope still. And even Kafka talks about truth and love and God. He's somehow trying to find those perspectives for him, but not believing in them. So Kafka is somehow the person very close to Max Weber in this ability of being so ambivalent and modern that everybody is somehow touched and recognized in his attempts to overcome this modern situation. And I was reminded on the exhibition I just saw in New York on Egon Schiele and his portraits. And for me, this ability of showing people in portraits and in loving situations in this way of being vulnerable and touched and verletzlich, vulnerable and fragmented. This is somehow the way Weber and Kafka lived and thought. And Jaspers, I would say, was always critical. He knew somehow that this way of living is not healthy. Ist nicht lebensklug, we say in German, not smart for life. If you are somehow are taking too seriously this recognition of your position and being sensible in that way that you cannot come to a way of living which is healthy for you and for the society. And Kant, I think, was always taking the position of being healthy for yourself and for the society, being responsible, and not taking this sensitivity to the extreme. And therefore, there's a certain limit in Jaspers. He's a therapeutic person, trying to help, trying to be a physician in a philosophical way. And he's not an artist, and he's not forced by his way of seeing the world, and he doesn't like to stay himself in desperation and to leave other people in desperation. Thank you.
Well, I think we can then continue the discussion what kind of philosophy Jaspers had actually envisioned and what that kind of therapeutic philosophy actually is. I think that was what attracted me both to Kierkegaard and Jaspers. For now, I would suggest that we give a round of applause to all of our speakers and to Matthias. I was wondering how much of the Jaspers critique about Freud or and psychoanalysis has not so much to do with the therapist, but more with a system creating some sort of what Jaspers would call Weltanschauung. So that the idea was, and I think that's what has Jaspers drawn to authors like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, whom he said, these have been die größten verstehenden Psychologen, the greatest psychologists of understanding. We don't really have a good word in English. It's maybe a hermeneutic psychologist, or but this other kind of psychology we do need to understand the inner life of the human being. And I thought that the main critics about Freud and his system was not so much his discovery of the Seelenleben, the mental processes, but putting it back into a medical model and turning it into a model of causal explanation and interpretation, and actually don't facilitate the process of what Jaspers calls philosophical elucidation, meaning making in the person oneself, but actually kind of doing this dangerous thing of offering a system and a method of interpretation, what those mental processes would be and mean, and in this way actually creating a Weltanschauung, some sort of religion, which I thought that was Jaspers' main point of seeing the real risk in that. So what I then have heard too is that psychoanalysts for sure say, well, we do that kind of differently, and we do listen to our clients, but that might mean because the psychoanalyst brings one's own Weltanschauung, or what Jaspers calls the Haltung zum Dasein. We already bring our attitude with us, which is important to be aware of that attitude as a therapist. But having a system which itself creates a causal explanation and is like a medical system, I thought that was kind of a point I would like to know more about, or put that into discussion.
So I could give a short answer. When you look at the critique Jaspers was giving on psychoanalysis after 1945, it only began when he went away to Basel. And the point was that he was saying in Heidelberg, Alexander Michle is trying to re-establish psychoanalysis at the university. And the university should always be a place where the young scholars who are at this university, the physicians, have the chance to choose a certain way of becoming a psychotherapist, but are not forced to choose this certain way. And Michle was smart enough when Jaspers was still in Heidelberg to say, yes, we will have this Institute of Psychotherapy, and we establish certain seminars, but those seminars are open for discussion and are not Lehranalysen. Also, mandatory, no, what is? Training analysis. Training analysis, which have to be chosen by the people. And only when Jaspers had left, he wrote an article about the need of a training analysis for everybody. And this was the point when Jaspers started to write his late articles on criticism on psychoanalysis, because this was somehow limiting and confining the freedom of the physician, of the young scholar, to choose his way of self-experience. This is one point I want to say. And the second point is that this criticism on Weltanschauung, which Jaspers had outspoken firstly in his book on the psychology of Weltanschauung, is connected to a certain attitude. He was estimating very much in Socrates, firstly, the skeptical attitude. This attitude of not knowing exactly what the truth is, but going on in the search of truth. And you have it already in the first essay, the philosophical essay he wrote in 1915 on Einsamkeit, where he is polarizing between the person of Jesus, who is somehow founding a school or a community or a church, with those who take him as a prophet. And on the other side, Socrates, who is the one who is not wanting to have pupils and does not want to be taken as a prophet.
I'm pleased that you bring up the hermeneutic perspective, the notion that we are all inevitably embedded in systems of which we are more or less aware, and in some cases not at all aware. And if we use that perspective and apply it to Jaspers, the question might become, to what extent are his ideas, particularly after 1945 themselves, a reflection and reaction to the system, or the systems of certainly National Socialism, in his emphasis on the individual and individual freedom and individual values, and needing to almost valorize them. And to what extent, to use a more critical perspective, might that perspective on the individual, though he also emphasizes community, to what extent might the perspective on the individual be a part of the post-war movement, not only in North America certainly, but also in Europe, in Western Europe, of the emphasis on the individual? And is there an implicit political agenda at work in that? You had mentioned Nietzsche a number of times. Certainly Nietzsche was critical of so many different perspectives, but I'm wondering if we would use that critical perspective and direct it at Jaspers after 45 and wonder what the emphasis on the individual was about and to what extent that emphasis may itself have become a reflection of social and cultural values and mores.
I'd like to put in a brief footnote about the issue of Jaspers and Heidegger that might bear on this, and that's, if you'll remember, when the denazification proceedings went on regarding Heidegger, Jaspers was asked to write a letter. And the core of the letter, from my point of view, was that he said, do not deny him his books, do not deny him his pension, but do not let him teach. And the reason given was that, as Jaspers understood it, the German youth were probably going to be too compliant and too willing to follow what they were told, especially if it was said in a certain kind of charismatic way, and that what the German youth of the time needed as much as anything was to think critically and to become more individuals than followers of groups or of a powerful personality. I think that's part of a driving element in the individualism.
Can I come back to the question, just because I thought it's so crucial with the critics of psychoanalysis that though context is important for sure, but I think what Jaspers mainly got from Kierkegaard, also from Nietzsche, but this really on the epistemic level, to say there is a subjective reflection and there's an objective reflection, there's a psychology of explanation, and there's a psychology of understanding, or hermeneutic psychology, and we need to be clear when to use what. So it's not like there is this one psychology and probably alternative there's this other psychology, but then how he has actually set up the psychopathology, and I'm not an expert for that, but there is the how does he call it, die beschreibende Psychopathologie, yeah, the descriptive, explanatory psychopathology, and then the is it called the individual, or the subjective psychopathology, the one which looks to the individual and the subjective processes, and I think the critics of psychoanalysis was really to mix them up and to not be careful to say, well, you cannot objectivize subjective processes. This is dangerous. This is kind of being the medical doctor and giving causal explanation for whatever is happening in a client's inner psyche, and therefore I think he was drawn to poets and other writers and saying this is another kind of psychology. We can describe symptoms, but we cannot, we cannot explain the inner psyche of the human being as Freud is suggesting it, without really risking to start some sort of a religious system. And so I think it's on the epistemic level where I think his critics is really important to keep in mind, because it probably would today apply to other psychological systems, behaviorism, or even every kind of manual-led psychotherapy.
Well, I would say there's a certain weakness in this point of Jaspers, because for my estimation, he did not take Weber's insight far enough that all scientific and psychoanalytic approach to people is connected to certain value standpoints, and his attempt to polarize between a possibility of just describing and those who are bringing their personal value judgments into a psychotherapy is not convincing for me, because you cannot just describe. There's always a certain cultural background of the way you're seeing persons. And there is a certain ethical dilemma in describing people by your cultural background. You can go wrong, you can go too far. And there should be a certain openness to tell people, this is my background, this is my cultural background. When I'm your therapist, you will have to encounter this and that value, which is important for me. And I cannot be a different person. I'm that person with this background. And Jaspers didn't think about that too clearly. So the task would be to establish a psychotherapy or psychoanalysis who's aware of the value judgments of the persons and the special group, and give the patients, or the clients as we say today, the chance to decide whether they want to share this perspective in order to feel healthier afterwards or not. And the way Michle did it, just talking about our empirical knowledge is not clear, because he's not seeing his own value judgments behind.
So he's directly critical in that sense, as many are today, of an objectivist perspective on human interaction and psychotherapy in particular. Yep.
Well, I just feel obliged. I should say something. So
Yes.
so I think.
More about Dylan.
Yeah, I mean, if I had a few more minutes to actually get to the end of the paper, I was going to bring him back in where he says in much more recent lyrics.
Do it.
He said, what does he say? He says, I travel a path that's been long abandoned. What's the term he uses? Ain't no altars on this long abandoned road. You know, ain't no altars on this long abandoned road. So this idea of this sort of hidden transcendence, you know, that can never be known. I think I see how Jaspers can be criticized for a kind of vision which retreats in some sense from the world. Somehow it doesn't bother me, because there's a part of me that feels sort of
Connected to it.
yeah, sure, justified by that. And I struggle with these things myself. And no one can really argue that the world has significantly evolved, you know, in moral or psycho-spiritual ways, I think, since at least I wouldn't argue that since Jaspers was working, and also he needn't be the only one we admire, you know. He writes so brilliantly about both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and that in itself I admire. And of course they are literary characters, it seems to me, as much as they are thinkers. Something Jaspers is not. You know, I mean, Kierkegaard really he writes with these pseudonyms. You know, he gives voice to various sort of selves within, and I think Nietzsche does this as well. He certainly writes about that, but he also seems to he just numbers all his passages in his books, and they don't all add up. They just come at you from different directions. And but anyway, this point, I guess, Matthias, about is this a limitation of Jaspers? For me, it's not, because I don't. He's not. I don't sort of read him exclusively. And if I were to sort of talk about Becker, who has
What's
this
his first name again?
Ernest Becker, you know, who has this. He is obsessed about. I would say through the course of his life, about trying actually to make the planet a better place, you know. And but on his deathbed, he's interviewed by Psychology Today, which in those days was a different kind of rag, and the interviewer Sam Kien asks him all sorts of questions, and there he speaks about. I think he invokes Max Horkheimer, if I remember correctly, and he speaks about communities of the abandoned, and he is he also talks about the sort of position of the aware sort of human being who comes face to face with, as he puts it, an absent God, and he's quite critical about America's inability to live up to its higher virtues. This is his expression, and instead produces only cheerful robots. And so even he, you know, after this lifetime of devoting himself to a better world, expresses thoughts that seem strikingly close in my mind to things that Jaspers is saying.
I just can only say that I have great sympathy with your point and your perspective, reading Jaspers from a philosophical and religious standpoint. I think this is his strongest point in this, making this, opening up and describing this perspective by his words and his philosophy. And I would say there's a great community of thinkers, historians, philosophers, cultural critics who are into this community. And the last one I read just the last days was George F. Kennan. I don't know whether you know his diaries. Yeah, it was so impressive to recognize that this Cold War historian was in his innermost a very sensitive, religious, self-critical person, making up about himself about the last and ultimate questions of life, and recognizing very clearly, even in the early 50s, that the American way of life is somehow not encouraging this perspective too much, yeah, and worrying about the Americans, what will happen to our country if there won't be any more places where people, could be inspired and open up for those perspectives.
I'd like to change perspective a little and raise what I think is an issue regarding what I'll begin by calling a certain problematic eclecticism in Jaspers. And here's what I have in mind. The talk about freedom, which we have brought up and discussed tonight, can be viewed one way if we're Kantians, because from a Kantian perspective, freedom is nonetheless circumscribed by a certain understanding of the inner life, which becomes a conflict and a duty to overcome that conflict between obligation or duty on the one hand and inclination or desire on the other. Now that's one picture, but I think we all agree that Jaspers is also very influenced by Nietzsche, whom he sees as a great psychologist. But there's a sense in which you can't easily harmonize and bring into your own philosophical thinking the kind of Enlightenment, universalist, Prussian austerity of a Kant, and then go down to Rücken in the Prussian province of Saxony, and have survived having a Lutheran father and a minister father and two grandfathers who are Lutheran ministers, and have Nietzsche's particular view about passions. These are hard to balance. Now, I have just one second thought that I'd like to mention that's slightly connected with this. I think most of us will remember the somewhat famous remark of Rilke's, which he gave at the point where he resisted Rainer Maria Rilke. When he resisted going into psychoanalysis, he said somewhat famously, "If my demons depart me, my angels may depart me as well." And that brings to mind what I think of as a certain outsider motif within European culture. And it amounts to saying that maybe a certain measure of instability or failure of cohesion is part of the creative dynamic of certain individuals, and that could be not necessarily at war, but uncomfortably related to the concern for integration, for sort of having a certain picture of the healthy life. But I don't know what more to say other than please don't take these remarks as coming from a philosophy professor. Think of them as coming from someone more like a rolling stone, a great unknown with no direction home.
I would like to sort of make a slight segue, but on the same theme, and then unfortunately I need to leave, but it's a personal anecdote if you allow me that, and that is I attended university in England, and I was a student at Cambridge and a member of Trinity College, and that's where I lived. And everyone knew where Wittgenstein's rooms were. He was a member of Trinity College. And when you would pass Wittgenstein's rooms, there was sort of an expectation as a philosophy student to make a nod in his direction. I wasn't an analytical philosopher, but that was the system of thought that was present at the university. And at the same time, this is late 80s, early 90s, there were whispers of Wittgenstein's diaries, presenting a different Wittgenstein altogether. Not an analytical philosopher as commonly understood or indeed as desired, not a student of Russell, someone who had all kinds of religious leanings and religious thoughts and doubts. And the diaries remained, there was a silence about the diaries. And I bring that up in the same context of how does one bring together these two perspectives, and is this eclecticism possible? In Jaspers, there is this eclecticism, but what are the systems involved that may allow it or in some way limit it? I guess that's the question I want to leave with. Thanks.
Yes, I'm very happy about the Kant and this hint to the eclectic attitude of Jaspers. I think you're totally right. With Nietzsche, you have this problematic perspective, which Jaspers didn't want to see sometimes. And then your second hint on the possibility or the need of people with some instability as a condition or a privilege in order that they are somehow, if they have a certain talent, able to see things deeper. For me, it was very interesting to read in James' Variety of Religious Experience in one chapter his laudatio, you could say, or his affirmation of this thought. And therefore I think Weber, Jaspers, James have this keenness and this openness for this privilege of sick people, of the sick soul, to be somehow a person who might see deeper in certain circumstances. And Jaspers himself wrote, on the way from psychiatry to philosophy, this book on Strindberg and Van Gogh, a pathography, which really takes this standpoint which James had developed before him. So I think this is American standpoint, having the idea that this sick soul could be important for society in order to see deeper than we all do in normal life. And one more thing, you were reminding me, asking in your comment, or asking whether the philosophical aspects of Jaspers could be answered by Weber. And it's so good that you arose with the question, because when I wrote the book, I wasn't too much into philosophy. I don't know whether I'm now more in philosophy, but a little bit more. So, and in the years to come afterwards, I took the perspective which you were mentioning of Kant's antinomy of freedom. And it's interesting that in Jaspers' 3 volumes of philosophy, there's a psychiatric chapter on suicide. And in this chapter on suicide, he's developing the Kantian idea of antinomy and applying it to the understanding of suicide and the possibility of man to commit suicide without being unfree.
Or as an authentic act,
Yes.
as in the case of Ellen West and Binswanger, that sort of thing?
This is a problematic thing. And Binswanger, I'm not a fan of him, I have to confess. For me, he's the psychotherapist or psychiatrist who's open for cultural aspects and philosophy, but somehow mixing up things too much and creating his own philosophy of psychotherapy with elements which do not fit together very well. And for me, but this would be would need some critical work. He's overestimated a bit. He's so good in bringing things together, but reading his books, you do not get a certain synthesis. This would be my criticism, but I'm not into it to explain it, but my idea.
No, I just wanted to defend Binswanger a little bit because he was an ongoing debate with Jaspers and certainly maybe suffered under his shadow in a sense because Jaspers had brought the phenomenological method to psychiatry, but not the way that Binswanger wanted. I mean, Binswanger really wanted at first to bring Husserl's phenomenological methodology and actually critiqued Jaspers on that he could have taken the phenomenological method more, and then there was also the anthropological moment in Binswanger as well, where he does bring in things. I mean, you know, Jaspers talks about live space and live time and all these phenomenological things, but Binswanger tries to develop a theory out of it. And I think one of the things with Jaspers, also in response to psychoanalysis, as you've pointed out, is really Jaspers is very, very skeptical about theories and the danger of theories. Just as you pointed out, the same theory could be adopted by somebody very dogmatic as opposed to somebody self-reflective. In that sense, it can be dangerous. And I think that Binswanger wanted to develop the theoretical side of phenomenology, that you could develop a theory. And in fact, Jaspers says as much as that in his later versions of the general psychopathology, that's what they did. That's what Binswanger and Strauss did. They made theories, and theories are to be overcome, as he says.
I was struck by something you said, Dr. Bormuth, and I hope I understood this right, that was it Jaspers who thought that it was maybe better in an analysis or in any human setting not to have a leader, not to have some teacher who had a kind of a prime place within the discussion. And I was thinking back to the origin of many movements, Christianity, where there was the circle and there was no apparent leader. I think in the Jewish, temple there was the circle. Is it humanly possible for any kind of group of humans to be together without a leader emerging? I think if we look back at our history, there is just, I can't think of anything where always this person comes forward. Now, this could be the individual striving of that particular person to be seen as a leader, but is it also the need of the rest that we always need something to look up to that gives us guidance? And those two things, I was just struck when you mentioned this. I said, well, how does this work within, our human society, our human being?
Thank you for the question. Jaspers himself talked in his Great Philosophers about the decisive persons, the decisive thinkers, die maßgebenden Menschen, mentioning Socrates, Jesus, Buddha, and Confucius. And I think he himself had his heroes, had his leaders, his geistige Führer, but and reading Jaspers, as far as I understand him, he means that we have somehow to understand those decisive persons, decisive philosophers, and then there's this certain term of Aneignung. I don't know what of make it our own and transform it somehow. So there should be this process of transforming a certain idea which is convincing for us in something personal. And this process of transforming and make it to my own, this should be in a way, in a dialogue, in a certain dialogue. And normally we have friends or other people with whom we talk and with whom we exchange ideas, how we transform thoughts of others, make them our own. And some people who behave as prophets or as teachers want to make disciples. Want that people just take their thoughts as they are and repeat them. And I think this is the point Jaspers means, that there should be a certain respect for the person who's interested in my thoughts. An openness that this person can say, no, I don't like all of your thoughts. And I think in personal dialogues, Jaspers behaved like this. Hannah Arendt was very fascinated by Jaspers as a partner of dialogue. She was more fascinated by Heidegger as a thinker. But the way she could talk with Jaspers, this was the point where she was fascinated of him as a teacher, who's not that brilliant than Heidegger was, but who was so open to respect the other one and to lead the other person to his truth. And I think in the background, Jaspers, that would be my interpretation, that we all do not know why one person is convinced by this thought and not by another one. There's somehow a personal mystery in all of us, while we apply to a certain horizon and do not like other things. Yeah, why I do not read Kafka very well and you do, but I'm convinced, and I was very much touched how you spoke about him. But something must be in me that makes me to not very good reader of Kafka. And this personal aspect, this mystery, we can somehow clear up, but not in all aspects. But there has to be a certain respect for the history of each person, his biographical background, his genetic background, so that we see, okay, this is his truth. And there must be struggle about political questions too, but normally with respect and with the love that the other person has his truth and is independent from me, and only therefore we can talk.
Could you say a few words about Jaspers as a political philosopher and his ideas about liberal democracy?
Just some words, because I'm not into the field of political philosophy too much. As it was mentioned, after 1945, he was part in the beginning of the movement of the Congress of Cultural Freedom. And it's very interesting that Melvin Lasky, who was in Europe one of the most important American intellectuals to encourage this Congress of Cultural Freedom, a friend of Hannah Arendt and a journalist in the Partisan Review group, visited Jaspers in 1945. And Jaspers, from 1949 on, he wrote himself that he was somehow trained in political philosophy by Hannah Arendt visiting him. Whether she was a good teacher, I do not know in political philosophy, but And the last point I want to make, that Jaspers became a political philosopher because of his experience between 1933 and 1945. Before that, he was a typical German existential philosopher, not interested in politics, like many were. And to recognize that the public sphere is so immensely influenced by certain things that it's worthwhile of philosophy was a great experience of those years for him. But maybe you have some more ideas.
No, that's fine. What came to mind was just Hannah Arendt's sense that Heidegger, who she'd almost been his disciple, and more than that, was sort of politically incompetent. That was her curious defense of him, that in the classical Greek sense, he was an idiotes. He just didn't get it.
A private man.
Yes, and had no sense of how to be political. And based on that, she wanted a philosophy of politics and of human action of people in the world. And on that basis, I think she found in Jaspers what, as far as I can see biographically, was a kind of model of a conversational partner that had interests that extended beyond existence. And I don't know if I brought the book, it doesn't matter, but in Jaspers' Reason and History, he tends to talk about the future in terms of something that would involve particular societies in the advanced world or countries becoming more and more in the direction of liberal democracies and eventually find ways to integrate. It's a kind of utopian regulative ideal, I think, but I'm not confident in saying that.
And I think this last point you made is there Jaspers is very close to Kant.
I think so.
Who has this text of the allgemeine Idee einer Geschichte in cosmopolitan respects.
Yes.
And this idea that the idea of freedom is something which unites the whole humanity, and that we all should take care of a development, a progress in the world society, which allows everybody somehow to live his own freedom, this Kantian dream.
Then surely we live in a dark age right now, don't we, as we're speaking.
So, and this dark age Kant already experienced, and Jaspers was somehow enthusiastic about this perspective and this love for freedom for everybody. Kant had.
Let's come back last time to the concept of appropriation, because I think it's really crucial. And I think that's what Jaspers really honored about, or in Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, that though he considered them teachers, they made it impossible kind of to have disciples, have followers, because they have been very sensitive about the method of how they actually communicate. And so the method of appropriation was so crucial to existential authors like Kierkegaard, to really kind of also have a very different method of communicating to the reader, that it is kind of impossible to turn it into a school which you can just follow without actually going through that process of appropriation. So there is this revival of the Greek method to indeed facilitate and foster a process of turning it into your own thought. So I was very struck when I read Jaspers on Aneignung, how much Kierkegaard was in that. Well, and having said this and looking on the watch, I thought we had so much to listen to, and there is a lot to ponder and to appropriate, that we probably just give all of us a break and do that, or find ourselves again in another setting and might continue the dialogue. But for now, I would like to wrap up this session and wish you all a good evening, and thank you so much for being here and presenting. Thank you.